Sue, maybe you could outline how you'd like the session to go tonight. I know you've got a presentation you'd like to give before there's kind of Q&A, but could you maybe give us a little highlight of what you would like to do tonight?
Well, I've got a PowerPoint, which is going to kind of provide you sort of the 30,000 foot overview, the franchise or license renewal process. But I want people to feel comfortable to ask questions as we go along. And I would ask Tim if you and maybe Alan can kind of watch. And if I miss a question from somebody, just interrupt me, okay? Because I think this is going to be better. And I always find it's more interesting to people if they're comfortable, if they want to ask a question as we go along, that they certainly should feel free to do so. So in general, that's the way I'll do it. Otherwise, it could get pretty boring if it's just me yakking for some time and then asking questions. So, I mean, some folks have questions. Some folks are totally comfortable waiting to the end. I can go. I'm easy on this stuff. I've done it a lot of times before. Each place is a little different, but yeah, I'm happy to accommodate whatever way you want to do it.
Tim, it's probably easier if we use the raise hand thing rather than the chat box.
Yes, that's a good suggestion. If you do have a question, use the raise hand feature, and Alan or I will spot you and point you out to Sue if she doesn't see you. But maybe Sue, if you wanted to get started with the presentation, that's probably the best way to kind of get into the subject matter, and the questions will probably suggest themselves as we go along.
Okay. Tim, one thing, do you want to just let folks know how you find the raise hand button?
On the lower right-hand side of your screen. If you click on participants, you'll get a list of all the participants showing up on the right side of your screen, and the raise hand thing is down at the bottom of that.
Okay, on mine, it doesn't show up there, but on mine I have reactions, and then I can raise hand if I go to reactions at the bottom of my screen.
Okay.
I'm going to try to get, for some reason, I'm not getting a share. I'm losing you guys when I bring up my video here. Let me, not my video, but my PowerPoint. So let me try to.
Barney, do you have the participants list?
I do. I clicked on that, but it doesn't, at the bottom, it just says invite or mute me.
Oh, mine has invite, mute me, and raise hand.
Yeah, no, it used to be like that, but then I just updated mine. And it doesn't have the raise hand there anymore.
Oh, okay. Well,
so it's in the reactions at the bottom. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Well, I'm sure people can get our attention if they have a.
Yep. Either way.
Just identify yourself. Yeah. Right. And we'll get to you.
Oh, fiddle! Now there it went away. Just a second. I'm going to have to go back and retrieve this. I got messing around, and you know how it goes. Here we go. Now, can you see my PowerPoint? Because I can just see the PowerPoint and not you at the moment.
Not yet.
Oh,
yet, but
okay, just a second.
You should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, I should. That's very true. Now, let me get back in here. It's open. It's there. All right. Now I get back into Zoom. Now let's go to share a screen. And there we go. Oh, come on. Oh, there.
Here it comes. Yep, there you are.
Now we're good. Okay. Okay. So I think we'll just get rolling here. So as I indicated, what I'm going to do is kind of give you a 30,000 foot overview of what the license renewal, or what in Massachusetts are called licenses, but they're also called franchises. If you look in the front of the document, it calls it a franchise, not a license. Okay, so if I use those two terms interchangeably, they mean the very same thing. So what we'll be doing is taking a look at what's involved when a cable company's franchise comes up for renewal. Now, these franchises in Massachusetts and in most other states are typically 10 years long. So what we're looking at here when we look at franchise renewal is we're looking at a document that was negotiated at least 10 years ago, and probably more like 11 or 12, because it takes a couple of years typically to do these processes. So if you think about how much telecommunications and cable and stuff and internet have changed in the last 10 years, you could well imagine that when we go through the renewal process, we need to be looking at where we're going to be as a community 10 years from now. So this is really like a community visioning process around communications issues. And even though this franchise or license agreement is only going to be about the cable part, it's the very same wire that Comcast also delivers you internet and telephone services on. Okay. And I'll get into some of the detail around where those crossovers happen in this process, but it's a communications planning process. There are specific rules of the road that local governments have to go through that are dictated by federal law and by state law as far as what happens when a cable company says, I want my franchise renewed. So I'll go over some of those sorts of things. We're going to take a look at what some of the opportunities are when you go through the franchise renewal process, and also why public input in particular is so critical to the outcome of these renewal processes. So that's kind of, a quick 30,000 foot overview of what I'm going to try to cover tonight. So first, let's take a look at why there has to be a franchise or a license in the first place. And that is because the cable companies are using the public property to put their wires on the poles or in the underground conduit spaces. The local government has the obligation and responsibility and the fiduciary responsibility to oversee and maintain and take care of that public property. If somebody like a cable company wants to come in and dig it up, and in this case, make a lot of money by having access to it, then they have to get permission. So what a franchise document really is a very sophisticated land use agreement. It's a lease. The cable operator is leasing the public property, and you as the select board are responsible for taking care of that public property and giving people access to it. So when we go through a franchise renewal process, first of all, we have to determine what the cable operator ought to be paying as rent for the use of the public property. That's part of what's in your current license agreement now, and I'll be sharing some of that information as we go on to the next slide. The next thing we need to understand is that what's also in this license agreement is what quality of service, what technology, customer service, all of those sorts of things are addressed in a license agreement. Now, some of them are dictated by federal and state law. Some things local governments do not have authority over. Let me give you an example of something you don't have authority over. You cannot tell the cable company what channels to offer. You can't say, bring me the golf channel, but don't give me the Disney channel or something like that. You have local governments do not have the right to do that. Local governments do have the right to say, hey, some of those channels ought to be for our community's use, for the schools, for the government, for the library, for the nonprofits, for the Rotary. That's what we call public education and government access channels. So those are sorts of things you do have say over. You also have say over where the cable company will be providing service in the community. Do they have to serve the whole community or just some parts of the community? How long is their line extension policy? In other words, from where they're on the pole or in the conduit to where your house is, how long is that gap before you have, what is the standard amount you don't have to pay extra to get installations for? Those are things you can do. So those are just examples of what you can and cannot do. As I mentioned, the license agreements are typically 10 years in length, and public input is a really critical part of the license renewal process. And that's the part that I'll be working with your community on. And that is what we call sometimes called ascertainment. And we'll be getting into a lot more about that and how you use the data and information that comes off the ascertainment process when you're going through this franchise renewal process. So let's first take a look at some basic Carlisle cable facts. Now, what I'm going to be doing is giving you a combination of some things that are in your current license agreement. I'm just going to hit the highlights, okay? And because I want to give you a sense of what's in there right now. To start out with, your license agreement is a 10-year agreement. It expires in October of this year. In talking with a town council and with your town administrator, it's pretty clear that we're going to have to extend that for a year to give proper amount of time to negotiate a decent agreement, because these things do not go quickly. I know places that have taken 5-6 years to negotiate their franchise agreements. So we've talked about going to the state and getting us an extension, and that's fairly common. Now, the next piece I'm going to tell you is very interesting. According to Comcast, first of all, in Massachusetts, you guys are really lucky, because the State Department of Telecommunications and Cable, they maintain a database of information that's submitted by the town, like the franchise agreements for pretty much all the towns in Massachusetts can be found on that website. The other thing that can be found is the number of subscribers in the community, the number of subscribers to cable service. So I went in and double checked what was the number of cable subscribers for 2019, which is the most recent year in the database right now for Carlisle. And it was 14,000 subscribers, what we call households are subscribing. Now,
1,400.
what became interesting to me is I went to Wikipedia, and you guys, and Tim, maybe you can jump in here. It said there are roughly 16 to 1,700 households in your community. Is that about right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's what's fascinating. If you factor that 1,400 against the 1,600, you're getting about 87% what we call penetration. In other words, 87% of the households in the community who could subscribe to cable do subscribe to cable. You know what the national average is? 50 to 55%. What that tells me is this is very lucrative, even if it's a small community. It's a very lucrative system for Comcast. The other thing that in today's world this also tells me is that probably the vast majority of those people, that 1,400, also subscribe to either internet or telephone service from Comcast. This is a very important piece of information you should be aware of, because your penetration level is extremely high compared to a lot of most any place I've heard of. It used to be we would occasionally find 10 years ago places that were 87% penetrated. Today, it's typically 50, 55%. So this is a very important thing to remember. Now, one of the things that's in your agreement that's a part of the compensation for the use of the public right-of-way, it's in the current one right now, is that the cable operator has to provide you 3 channels for your community use, what we call public education and government access channels. Now, it's my understanding that you all have an agreement with the town of Concord to manage those channels and provide and make sure meetings get covered and other programming gets on. Of course, in the last year, that's been curtailed because of COVID, and the folks couldn't get out in the community and do a lot of programming. But in your current license agreement right now, you have 3 channels that are dedicated for public education and government access. Another thing that you have is some funding for that. Now, your funding level is over the 10 years of the license agreement. It was a total of $90,000. Not a lot, but I've seen some with none, and I just looked at Bill Ricca, and they recently renewed their franchise agreement, and they're at about $400,000. Everett's at about $650,000 as what the capital grants are. So what I'm saying is that it gives you a sense. I know those are much larger communities, and I completely understand that, but I just wanted to give you a sense of kind of what some of the opportunities might be out there in the future. But the current license agreement has $90,000 over a 10-year period of time, so it was roughly $9,000 a year. Also, the PEG annual funding, which is called the franchise fee, is at 4.85% of gross revenues. Now, under federal law, that franchise fee is capped at 5% of gross revenues. So that's the federal law piece. You're at 4.85%. And that 5% cap has been in place at that level at 5% nationally since 1984, a long time. But that's what was passed. That's the number that was in the 1984 Cable Act. That's a number that continues to stay in place. Another thing that is in your current license agreement is the ability to originate programming for broadcast to cable subscribers in Carlisle from Town Hall, and also from the studio, what we call your access TV station, at the Concord Carlisle Regional High School. You all probably know all about that already, but I wanted to let you know that that's actually an obligation in the current license agreement. So as we think about this, if we want those things to continue, or if we want something more expansive, then that's part of what I want you to be aware you can negotiate for, okay, in a new license agreement. Other things that are in your current license to schools and to community locations, all of these things are on the table in franchise renewal. In other words, you don't automatically go, oh, we're starting from where we're at and then we're negotiating up from there. No, technically, and I'm saying technically, you zero it out and start from scratch. Okay. And that's a lot of times what the cable operator is going to make you justify what you have, let alone try to get something. I mean, again, thinking about how much community and communications have changed since 2010 or so, you're looking at a license agreement that won't expire till 2030 or 31. This is the gap we're looking at here when we look at these numbers. So I just wanted you to be aware of some of the compensation that's in your current license agreement for the use of the public right of way. Now, I take a look at conservatively what Comcast has at stake here. I know Carlisle is not a large community, but I also know it's a very beautiful community. But if you take that 1,400 subscribers and you multiply it by a conservative number of $120 a month per subscriber. Now that's intended to be not to represent only the cable bill, not the internet part or the telephone part. So I'm being conservative with this number. So 1,400 subscribers times $120 a month times 12 months times 10 years, that's over $20 million. Now that doesn't take into consideration rate increases over that 10-year period of time. And that also doesn't take into consideration the dollars and cents that the company is going to be able to leverage from internet and telephone service revenues. All right. And those will be probably about triple of what the cable revenues are. So when you begin to look at tripling that $20,000, okay, $20 million over the years, you can begin to see that even in a small community, having the license, having the franchise agreement is a very valuable commodity to Comcast or whatever cable operator it might be. So I wanted to kind of give you a sense of not only what's the compensation packages in your current license agreement, but also what's at stake for the company in getting that license renewed, which is why it sometimes takes a long time, a lot of negotiating to get the renewal processes completed. So let's take a look at what the opportunities are for the future. Now, a couple of things sort of come to mind and are sort of obvious as we sort of start looking at these things. First, you want to make sure that in the new agreement, you're guaranteeing to the degree you can that the people in your community are going to have state-of-the-art communication services. What that means is that the technology that the cable company is going to be utilizing to deliver the service in the community, okay, is state-of-the-art technology. Now, what we've seen over the last 10 years or 12 years is, and I'll jump back a little bit here to give you a little historical perspective on this. Your original cable system was primarily what we call a hybrid coax system. There was a lot of coaxial cable in it and a little bit of fiber, okay? In today's world, the companies have built more and more fiber into the systems and then using less and less coax. Why? Because of the greater capacity and capability to deliver services. So in your community right now, my guess is that you've got quite a bit of fiber, but it certainly isn't fiber to the home. Now, you don't necessarily need fiber to the home, but all I'm saying to you is in the license renewal process, you just want to make sure that whatever technology the cable operator is going to be using is just going to guarantee that your residents and businesses have the highest quality cable service, whether it has to do with picture and sound quality or the volume of services provided. That's something that you can have language in your license agreement that deals with. Obviously, assuring quality customer service. Your current license agreement includes the customer service standards, which were adopted, 30 years ago now at the federal level. They're pretty old. And I find that it's kind of good to go through those and update them. And one of the easiest ways of updating your customer service standards is simply to look at what some communities, like There are certain communities around the country who've done a really good job, who have Comcast, of updating their customer service standards. And now they're larger communities, but it doesn't matter that they're larger, because the basic things about customer service are the same, whether you're in a little town or in a big city. For instance, Seattle, Washington has very, very good customer service standards that they worked out with Comcast about 5-6 years ago, probably even longer ago. So I can provide you guys and Tim and the city attorney, town attorney, with information about what are some of the places that have kind of state-of-the-art customer service standards. So you can look at those and say, okay, gee, ours are a little dated, maybe we need to update them. So that's another opportunity for the future. A third one, and this is one that is looked at very closely by a lot of places in the country and Massachusetts as well, is assuring that there's adequate support for public education and government, your community channels. In other words, that means, are the community channels, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, are they able to use state-of-the-art technology? In other words, right now, your channels are all what we call standard definition. They don't look as good as your NBC, ABC, or CBS affiliate or HBO. Why? Because they're in standard definition, not high definition. You can require a cable operator, if people want to have their local channels to look as good as the other commercial channels on the cable system, you can require them to provide them in HD. And in fact, many communities across Massachusetts have at least one HD channel, if not more. One community I've worked with over the last few years, in Oregon, for instance, all of their access channels, of which they have 8, okay, are all in high definition. In some communities in Massachusetts, we see 1 of the 3 in high definition. So again, this is something that's an opportunity for the future. Assuring that Comcast pays adequate rent for the use of the right-of-way. And that's some of the things I've kind of been blending in throughout what I've been talking about so far. And that has to do with everything from support for community media and for PEG access to the franchise fees, to customer service, etc. In other words, making sure that the value that you guys are getting back to your residents and businesses is equivalent to the value that Comcast is getting back for having access to the right-of-way and to deliver services to community. Because you can begin to see that as we look at this process, it's really not, it's a communications planning process. I mean, you need to take a look at where as a community you're going to be in 10 years. Maybe you've done a strategic planning process, or maybe some of your departments or the libraries have done that. Take a look at those plans. Those are all things that we need to look at in the license renewal process. So now I'm going to take a little bit deeper dive into a couple of things to kind of, I'm peeling the onion. I'm kind of going down a little deeper into it now. One of the things that's happening with the community channels is that they're not just about access TV anymore. They're about embracing the evolution from the way we used to think about these PEG channels as TV stations to something more than that. And let me give you an example. And you're doing some of this already, making sure that the programming that's on those channels is also available on multiple platforms. In other words, online. Now, granted, you guys are in a little different situation than a lot of places because you have such a high cable penetration, okay? But making sure that part of that evolution is making sure that we have multiple means of getting that information out about your community that's on those channels. Another one is to make sure that, as I pointed out earlier, that the channels are high definition. The equipment that is used to create to make the pictures, to make the TV is all high definition equipment. You can't buy standard definition cameras anymore, okay? So why in the heck are the access channels being delivered in standard definition when the signals are being created in high definition? It's just something that was never negotiated in your current license agreement. And a lot of people are, and so that's kind of keeping your community and its services equivalent to what might be considered state of the art. Making sure that the programming that runs on those community channels are listed in the electronic bulletin board. Like when you go in and you want to see what's on tonight, if you're looking at your cable, making sure that where the access channels are, the PEG channels are, it doesn't just say Carlisle channel, or public access, it says the name of the show, just like, and a description, just like any other shows. In other words, let's not treat our community content as second-class citizens to everything else. This is sort of taking things from that sort of TV thing to really community media. Another thing is the ability to transmit programming live from multiple locations in the community. You have a parade or a celebration for the 4th of July or whatever, being able to go live. Think about people who are shut-ins at home, can't get out, and being able to see the 4th of July parade or the homecoming parade or whatever that celebration is unique to Carlisle. I know you guys do a lot of snow. I saw a cross-country skiing things and stuff on your website. Having the ability to maybe do some of those events live on your access channels is something that many places have been doing for a long time. But again, this takes things from this sort of just a TV mode to really more about a community. The other piece, and I'm going to describe this to you because it's a pretty cool example, is I've worked for a number of years with a group of small communities outside of Portland, Oregon, Gresham, and they banded together, and they have one community media center. There's 6 of them that serve all 6 of those little towns. And it's called the access organization that runs, it's called Metro East. Okay. And it's because it's eastern suburbs of Portland, Oregon. And they did a project in conjunction with community development and community development and sort of citizen services. There was a part of one of the towns that had become a landing spot for a lot of new immigrants. Okay. And in part because a lot of the churches in that area were sponsoring new immigrants coming in, and this neighborhood was a low-income neighborhood, and there was affordable housing. What happened was a community media center there, the access organization, decided, let's set up a place, and it's going to be in conjunction with our cities and our library and whether we're okay, and learn, and where there's youth activities going on around video and media and gaming, that is putting kids in a spot where they learn skills and are doing something positive. And this project has gotten a lot of national attention. Now that's an example of taking it from just about TV to really about using media for community beneficial purposes and having it embrace all forms of technology. So I'll be talking more about this as we go deeper into our needs assessment process activities, but I just wanted to give you a sense of it's an opportunity out there. You may or may not be interested in it, but you at least ought to be aware of it. So as we now look at the license renewal process, now we'll get into some of the stuff that for some folks may be boring. For me, I'm a policy wonk, so I find it interesting. I'm going to give you a bird's eye view of the federal renewal process that the town has to go through. And you are starting through that process right now. So it starts when a cable company says, I want my license renewed. And that starts between 2.5 and 3 years before the current license expires. And that federal process requires you to do a performance review of the cable operator. In other words, have they complied with their current contract? It requires you to do a needs assessment. That's the part I'm helping you out with, getting public input. That's what's called a community needs assessment. And you take the data from those 2 things, and that shapes what you are working toward in negotiating a new license agreement. And it shapes it not only from the standpoint of being based on public input, but it shapes it also on being based upon what the law says it should be based on. And so that's why when we're doing our focus groups, I'll talk about a little bit later, and our online survey, having maximum participation in those things is so very important. And having diverse participation in them is really important. Once you get that information in from the performance review and the needs assessment, it creates the framework for what you go to the negotiating table and negotiate for. There is a process that is called the formal process. I'm not going to get into it tonight. Most cities and towns never get there. That is, if you can't get to an agreement through negotiations, then it requires the formal issuance of an RFP, and it gets very complicated. And you're more restricted in your rights. You can accomplish things in negotiations typically that you cannot typically accomplish in the formal process, but sometimes some places have to go to the formal process. And I have been down that road with a number of cities before because the cable operator just was not being reasonable at the negotiating table. So I'm gonna mark out here just a few of the things that you need to look at when we're doing the performance review aspects. And I've kind of touched on a number of them already. But for instance, taking a look at that 4.85% of gross revenues and making a determination through a hybrid audit process as to whether the cable companies actually paid the right amount of money. Okay, and that franchise fee audit is something that some communities do in franchise renewal. Another thing to be looking at when you're in renewal is you look at the existing license agreement. You go, okay, there's a performance bond of $25,000 in there. Has the company maintained the performance bond? There's insurance requirements for being in the right of way. Has the company maintained those insurances at the level? With regard to that 4.85%, your current license agreement says that the cable operator should have been submitting quarterly financial reports, okay, showing how much they were paying and the foundation for that funding, okay. So you go to the license agreement and you do it when you do a performance review and you take a look, and I just hit the obvious high points there, and you can go to extremes on this on either end. You can go not do it at all, okay, or you can get way out of control and go to a real big extreme. I tend to say at least hit the big stuff, okay? The stuff that I mentioned, plus there's about 5 or 6 other categories of things that I go into a license agreement. I go, we're going to look at this, and this, and we're going to have the town ask the cable operator if the town has no record of those things being filed, then let's ask the cable operator, have you filed them? And if so, or if not, please give us copies, all the back copies you owe us. Why? Because they're supposed to be doing it all along. It's part of their obligations under the contract. So these are the sorts of things you look at when you're going through the performance review aspects of a franchise or license review. The next piece is the needs assessment process. And this is the piece that really is sort of the forward-looking part of this process. I mean, if I back up here for just a second, you're going to see on that 4th bullet there, as you do the compliance review, you want to look at the public input that's gathered during the needs assessment process. And that public input would have to do with picture and sound quality. Did the company come out when they're supposed to come for their appointments, that kind of customer service stuff? That'll all be in particular in the online surveys that we're going to be putting out. But the needs assessment process that we'll be conducting for the town of Carlisle is going to include a number of things. First of all, this briefing, okay? Secondly, we'll be doing a group of 3 community focus group stakeholder workshops. Now we have to do them because of COVID using Zoom. And I put together a 2-page detailed work plan, and I'll be working with your town, with Tim, and to help implement that. We'll be needing to identify people who in these stakeholder meetings. And because, if we were doing them in person, we could just say, come one, come all, come to any one of them you want to come to. But because we're doing them on Zoom, we're kind of limited in how many people we can get on a Zoom call and have a conversation with, okay? So we will be asking you guys if you have suggestions about people who should be, for sure, be part of those meetings. And that would be leaders within all the community groups, faith-based community, youth, seniors, neighborhood groups, human and social service organizations, Rotary, service organizations, and of course, elected officials, school teachers, etc. But the key here is we want to be able to make sure that we get as diverse as possible of a leadership group as we can participating in the stakeholder meetings. Now we're anticipating that we'll be holding them April 7th through 9th. There'll be 3 different ones, that each meeting will be about an hour and a half long. On that first day, we'll also be opening an online survey that is open to anybody in the community who wants to participate. And I would love to see 400 or 500 people at least or more responding to the online survey. And it's going to ask questions not only about past performance of Comcast, whether they subscribe or not, if they do subscribe, what their experiences have been. We're also going to be talking about all the sort of potential things for the future that might be of interest. Another piece of the needs assessment process there is the fourth bullet on this PowerPoint slide is an evaluation of the current resources that are available for your community channels, for your public education and government access. In other words, and so what we've already done, we put together a group of forms and we've submitted them to the staff over at Concord who are running your channels for you. And they are working, I actually have a phone call with them already. We've gone over the stuff. They're going to get me back the data on all the equipment they have, the kind of classes that they were providing, if they were providing classes up until COVID set in and they couldn't have anything in person after that. We'll be gathering all of that information to take a look at what's in place and how much it's being used. And then we look at that in the context of the information that we gather from the focus groups and the online survey. And we see, is there a gap presently, let alone is there going to be a gap in 10 years? Okay. And that helps us to determine what things you all ought to be thinking about as far as recommendations of things that should be in the new license agreement. So that's another piece of the needs assessment process that we'll be undertaking. The result of all of that work, this meeting, the focus group, stakeholder meetings, the online survey, and then I'm typically always ask people if there are organizations or institutions in the community like school or whatever that have a communications or a strategic plan, I would love to see it, because that means that institution or that organization is looking to what the needs of its constituents are in the future, and that should be considered when we're looking at what the broader communications needs are of the community. So that's another sort of thing that I'll be requesting as we go along and working on the needs assessment process. So in sort of summarizing with the next two slides, the desired outcome of any renewal process is to make sure that the bandwidth and capacity and the function, what we call the functionality, meets not only current but future community needs. Okay, that we're 2021. What's it going to be 2031? That the funding and resources necessary for the community to effectively use the channels for something about the community, not just about stuff coming from elsewhere. Okay, if it's adequate. Okay. If the town itself has actually done a strategic or strategic goals or whatever, to make sure that we're taking those into consideration and making sure as part of the desired outcomes of this renewal process that we take those things into consideration to make sure that the town will be able to meet its residents' communications needs to the degree it has control over those things, obviously. So those are, and that's just three really broad bullets, but I wanted to, they kind of summarize all the things I've been talking about in a way. So, you know, as I wind things up with this slide, building better communications future through license renewal and how you can help. We have to come up with a list of probably at least 30 people to participate in each one of those three focus group meetings, stakeholder Zoom meetings. We would love to have your suggestions as to who that might be. And you don't have to do it on tonight, but Tim and I will be talking later on and we'll want to get that from you. Also, once we put out the invitations about when the online survey is going to happen, if you're associated with a group like the Rotary or any other group or organization, you have a website. Obviously, we'll be posting when these activities are going to occur on the town website, but we want to make sure that they get out on the websites and in social media through all of the organizations that are there in Carlisle and that are serving people in the community. The more we can sort of blanket the outreach around gathering this public input, I think the better the input will be and the more diverse the input will be. That will be, and it'll give a clear advantage to Carlisle when. So with that, I guess I'll be quiet and answer your questions.
This all seems to be at least based upon the primary service they're providing is cable TV. To what, but to what degree do the other two services, internet and phone, fall into that as well?
They don't.
Okay.
Right now, and they don't, but that's a little bit too definitive a negative answer. So let me expand on it a little bit. Okay, the law is right now written in a siloed manner. And it hasn't changed in years other than tweaking around the edges of it, basically. You have a body of law that deals with cable. You have a body of law that deals with telephone, and then broadband is the other piece. They don't overlap. However, the cable operator delivers all those services on the same wire. Okay, so when we talk about the functionality that you can get at on a renewal for a franchise agreement, that same capability, if it's state-of-the-art capability, it will also impact those other services. Okay, same with the customer service. So even though technically this is a franchise renewal process for a cable franchise, because it's all on the same wire, okay, when we get into when we get into who the service can be delivered to, in other words, a line extension issue, if the line's going into your home for cable, you're going to be able to take internet and telephone if you wish to as well. So it's not quite as black and white as I may have made it out, but they really are it's a siloed law right now. It needs to be all rewritten. It hasn't been changed in forever.
Thank you. Okay, Glenn Pasternak.
Great, thank you. I almost got my video. I'm curious if the video, cable and internet and phone are not under the same body. Can we request that Comcast unbundle them? Because right now, I don't use a phone, I don't use TV. All I want is internet, but Comcast doesn't offer just internet. Can we put that into this agreement?
Well, that's odd because most places Comcast does offer them as separate services. Now, sometimes they'll bundle the cable piece in almost for nothing if you want the broadband. But that's something I'll need to look at, because if they're actually not allowing you just to take broadband separate, then that would be unusual.
Really? Someone has just internet. All right. Last time I called, they didn't give that as an option.
Oh,
Right.
Sometimes they don't tell you things, okay, which has to do with customer service, okay? And I don't mean that to be negative or disrespectful. It's just the way all of the cable companies are. They don't, let me give you an example. One of the things that we find sometimes is there's a level of service that's what I might call basic service. That's maybe $19.95 a month or even $10.95 a month, but they don't advertise it on their website. And you wouldn't know that it was even available unless you knew somebody who had it and you asked for it, and then you would get it. So this is also kind of a consumer issue. And so when the town goes through the license renewal process, they need to just make sure that they're on top of the state consumer laws. I'm not saying Comcast is not complying with them. I'm just saying it's something you guys, as you become smarter about all of this, you should be aware of.
Jed Weinstock.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for that presentation. We have just internet since we moved here, one question is anything about, so we don't have a competitor here. Some places, like when we lived in Newton, we could choose between, I think it was Comcast and Verizon.
Yeah.
Is this 10-year agreement giving some kind of exclusive rights to Comcast? Or I don't know what prevents a town from bringing in a competitor. It seems like it would certainly be better for everyone in the town to have a competitor. And I don't know if it's part of our agreement that we don't have a competitor. So I had one question about that. And then just so I don't want to come on again and speak. My totally unrelated point is the big news these days is the data cap. And that seems like a really, really bad thing for consumers as everyone's data is skyrocketing right now. And I'm sure we'll just go, the second they introduce a new video standard, all of a sudden it multiplies. So I don't know. it didn't seem like there was anything in the presentation about negotiative. I mean, certainly nothing about price negotiations, and then something like data cap. I don't know if that falls more into the service versus the price, but certainly if there's anything we could do to negotiate away from that, that would be a good thing. Thank you.
Two really good questions. The first one is the franchises by federal and state law are non-exclusive. In other words, another cable company time they wish. Okay. And that is something, but it's up to Verizon, frankly, could have come in years ago. And they made a choice, just as they did in other communities in Massachusetts and around the country. They said, hey, I guess we've extended our service as far as we want to go for now. Okay, we're not going to do any more cable franchise agreements. And actually, Verizon made that decision probably, let me think here. I've got to be thinking probably 2008, 2009, they quit expanding and getting new franchise agreements. Something like in that territory. So number one, there's nothing in your license agreement, nor can you have it by law that prohibits another company to come in. And I'll be really frank with you. Number two, another company won't come in because they do not, they obviously have made a business decision that it does not make sense for them to string a whole nother set of wires, because that's what they would have to do, because the physical plant itself is owned by Comcast and they are not obligated to share that with anybody else. So if Verizon came in, Verizon would have to wire the entire community with the capability to deliver cable services. So, I mean, I know this is, for some folks, it's really annoying and aggravating, but that's just, I'm just being very honest with you and I'm being very practical with you. Now, there are a few places that are quite rural where we are seeing rural electrical co-ops, places where the town has run its own electrical service because many, 100 years ago or whatever, a for-profit electrical company did not come in and offer service. And some places we're seeing rural electrical co-ops starting to offer media services and cable services. And that's something that actually has been going on for 25, 30, 40 years. There's actually a national association for rural electrical co-ops that is municipally owned or co-op owned, but that's really, I think, kind of neither here nor there in your circumstance. I just wanted you to be aware of that. As far as data caps, as far as rates, local governments do not have the right to negotiate. Remember I said at the beginning, I said there's some things you can do and some things you can't do. Rate regulation, you cannot do. When I started working in this field a long, long time ago, we had rate regulation. And then over the years, it's gradually been removed from the authority of local and state governments. So, and the data cap thing has to do with the broadband piece, not the cable piece. So even if you could do rate regulation, which you can't on the cable side, you still couldn't touch it on the internet side, on the broadband side. Good questions.
Kate,
On my street, the cable is neither buried nor strung. They have just laid it on top of the ground. So
that should not be.
Well, it's a fact. So
has it been that way for a long time?
Yep.
Well,
and I have to tell you, it took me 25 years to get them to bury my cable on my property that goes from the street to the house. It literally took me 25 years to get them to bury that. But there are portions of the street which are just laid right on top of the ground.
Okay, so number one, my guess is that violates the franchise.
Well,
number two, it probably also violates national electrical standards. Okay, and a whole bunch of other ones. I'm really amazed that it's that way. It's literally laying on the ground. It's not fallen off a pole. It's just always been on the ground.
They've just, in fact, a few years ago, I don't see Karen here anymore, but a few years ago, they put a new one in and they just laid it right on top of the ground. And you can see where it goes, sometimes there's like a loop and it's kind of like, flopping around. and it's just right on the floor of the forest.
Yeah, you should say, Kate, you don't have poles in your neighborhood.
No, I don't have,
You have underground electric.
I know, but yes, yeah, you're right. You're right. We have buried utilities, except that our cable is not buried.
Okay, so you do have buried utilities. Who do you get your phone service from?
I get it from Comcast. I used to get it from Verizon, I think.
Right. So how did Verizon get your phone service in?
From a telephone, there's a underground telephone wires, and then there are boxes.
So there must be conduit in that area. That's my.
There is conduit. That's why it's so surprising to see when they put the new cable in, that they just plopped it right on the top of the ground.
I think, Tim, you and I need to talk about this one because it's pretty, I'll go back and look at the license agreement, but that's pretty clear. It's a violation of the license
So
agreement.
those are the kinds of things I'm assuming that you're going to be wanting to collect around town from other, because I happen to know about this because it's in my neighborhood, but I couldn't possibly tell you about some of the things that I think probably are happening, in other parts of the.
Well, I mean, one of the things that, and I'll go in as deep as you want me to go in this right now, and then we'll take the rest of it up maybe with Tim. But bottom line is, you must have public works staff for the town, or you have contracted. You're like, Alan is smiling at me. Okay, did I ask a bad question?
Yeah, we have public works.
Yeah, we both of them.
Both of them. Okay. Well, I guess my point is this. This may merit having either gathering, I mean, you could probably put something out to the community and say, do you have your cable lines laying on the ground?
Yeah.
See what you get. And then using that as a jumping off point, okay? I guess my tendency would be then to call your local government affairs person for Comcast and say, listen, we're starting this license renewal process, and we're finding out that over here and over here, and then we looked at our license agreement, and it appears to be that maybe this is not the way it's supposed to be. I would say it would be you're at a good point to gather that kind of information, and then if you find that there's more than just an occasional circumstance of this sort of thing, you might want to either have your public works folks or actually bring a contractor in for a couple of days just to look at this stuff and document it. I worked with Scarsdale, New York a couple of years ago, and it's not Comcast, it's a different company. But they had huge problems with the way the plant was maintained. It was just a mess. And there was lots of just public safety issues that were go along with that. So anyway, I would suggest that that's something that I can help whatever way you want me to help word things, but I think it's definitely the kind of stuff we want to find out.
Okay.
Other questions?
Kate, your hand's up again. Did you? Oh, no.
No, it's.
Oh, that's Carlin Reed.
Yes, I'm the other Reed involved in town governance.
Spell it differently.
Yeah, a little bit. It sounds the same though, a lot like it. I'm Carlin Reed. I actually live in Concord, but I'm the chair of Concord's Cable Advisory Committee, the PEG Access Advisor. And I just want to let you know, if you need some information or some type of references, feel free to contact me.
Okay.
Tim has my contact information. We have a web page up, and actually Tim sits as an ex officio member of our committee. Our next committee meeting is on January 14 at 9:30. And one of the items on the agenda that I'm going to put on is a brief review of what's going on in Carlisle, because our franchise agreement expires April 2024. So you guys get to go first, and we're going to watch what happens after that. So it's gonna be really interesting, but we do have some information, and we do share information about both towns on occasion. So I just want to give you that offer on that. Okay.
And I appreciate that a lot. One of the things that I would just suggest you guys think about, because I know right now is figuring out a way of making sure that you leverage each other as far as communities in these renewal. I mean, I kind of specialize in doing joint powers agreements where you have multiple local governments negotiating at the same time, even though their franchises may not be at the same time. So I know a lot about that coordination and that making that happen. When I first got involved with this process and I first talked with Tim and the town attorney, and I became aware of the relationship between Concord and Carlisle on the PEG part, that was the first thing that jumped into my head. Is there a way of making sure that you take advantage of the larger base of subscribers that would be represented by Carlisle and Concord coordinating? Now, I know New Englanders are very independent and I respect that, okay? But I'm just saying that this could be an advantage and there's different ways of getting there, but I just throw that out to start to think about. And Carlene, I'm glad it sounds to me like you're sort of thinking about something anyway, so.
Mark Sesniak.
I have a couple questions. First, do we know how many houses or homes in Carlisle are not connected to cable and what it would take to get them all connected? Or is everyone connected and just not everyone gets cable?
Well, what I know, and Tim, you can help me with this, is if there's between 16 and 1,700 units,
Right.
I won't call them dwelling units, I will call them units because they could be a business.
Right.
And there's 1,400 of them already subscribing, then
Yeah.
that gives us a number who aren't subscribing. And then the issue becomes of those who aren't subscribing, who can't subscribe because it doesn't get there, doesn't get to their home. Tim, any insight from you on that?
No, I think that's accurate. If the dwelling units are about 1,700 or 1,400 subscribers, the difference is about 300 that either can't be served or have no interest in being served, and it's hard to tell. You know, you have to do a little more digging to find out what the case is. But
There is a rumor that there are some houses that would like to get cable but have not gotten it yet.
And that could
cable
be
doesn't
that-
reach there.
That gap. When I started to look at what we call the subscriber penetration, which is that the number of homes passed versus the number of homes, and actually, we don't know if that 1,700 are actually all passed. We know that there are 1,700, and we know that 1,400 subscribe, but maybe those 300 aren't passed. Or they could be choosing not to take cable. We don't know that.
Yeah.
So it's not a huge number, but it's definitely something to be aware of. The other piece of this that gets kind of interesting to me is that the strength and power of using your community channels in a community where you've got that high a percentage of people subscribing to cable, they become incredibly valuable communications assets for you to get information to the public. Because obviously some people are going to go online if you put the stuff online and they're going to get it. But some elderly people, so there are people who in the community who are not comfortable doing that. And they're going to be, and they typically are older folks, okay? They're going to be relying solely on those community channels. So unlike places where you only have 50% of the people subscribing to cable, you got a huge, almost everybody. So the value to you of effective utilization of community channels is significant.
So I have another question. If we don't come to an agreement, what happens? Do we lose our cable and everything?
No, what basically happens is, and the franchises just keep getting extended till you get to an agreement. That's what happens. And I say that because somebody sooner or later, either the town or the city or the cable operator are just going to get frustrated and finally just sort of, that's why it really is a negotiation, okay? And that's why Salem, Oregon, state capital, but a mid-sized community, it took 8 years. They took 8 one-year extensions off the franchise when it expired to finally get to an agreement that they were satisfied with. So they never lost cable. The subscribers never lost service. The negotiations just continued and the franchises were extended for 6 months at a time or, a year at a time or whatever.
And if we don't come to an agreement, like if we just decide it's not worth it, or I'm not saying we will, but is
Well,
that even an option, or is it that just automatically extends because we can't agree on anything?
No, what happens is, there and under federal law, there are two processes. There's the informal and the formal process. And I really explained to you the informal process because that's the manner in which 99.9% of the franchises are complete, renewals are completed. The formal process is one where what you're describing, you're going down the path, okay, of not being able to get the franchise renewed. And under the formal process, once the town could say, I'm sick of, I spent 4 years doing this and these guys are not being reasonable and we did the process right and we did all our homework and we justified our data legally and they still won't agree. Then you do something called issuing an RFRP, which is called a request for renewal proposal. At that point, everything that you've gathered freezes and you can't add any new data. You can't, and this formal process then will take roughly another couple years, okay? So your data freezes, your documents freeze. I mean, the company keeps operating, but then you go into it, the company has to submit a very extensive formal proposal. I mean, when we used to do these things in 3-ring binders, it would be 4 or 5 big 3-ring binders full. I mean, that's how much detail that goes into these formal processes. Once you get it, then you have 120 days to review the formal process and determine whether the cable company has met the requirements contained in the RFRP that you have issued as a town. And there are certain things that you can require in that RFRP. And so if they haven't met those things that are in that RFRP, met the requirements, then you have an ability to deny that right to renew that franchise. And if you deny the right to renew that franchise, then you go into an administrative law hearing process. Okay, now you can see why most places get done through the negotiations informally, because I've done in my quite a number of years of working in this field, I've only run into three places where one of my clients got involved in a process that went all the way to the administrative law hearing process. And interestingly, in every single case, the administrative law judge ruled in favor of the city. Because you don't get yourself down that wire that far and spend that kind of money without knowing legally you're in the right. But I would say across the board nationally, over the last 40 years, there's probably only been 10, 12 places that have actually had to go all the way to the administrative law hearing process. And I may be underestimating very slightly, but it's just not common. Let's put it that way. But that's the process. You can kick them out. There was one of the early places that actually denied renewal and the cable company walked away was a very, very small town in rural Kentucky. And that was in about probably early 70s, 74, 75.
Kate?
I'm wondering if it's possible for us to get a map of where the company has wires. That would help us determine if there are areas of our town that are just not, covered.
Sir. Yeah.
That would help us.
Yeah.
I think that would be an important part
Well,
piece of information.
In answer to your question, yes, you should be able to get mapping. It's not a single map. I will tell you, having gone through this other places, I think that a starting point would be to ask the cable company for documentation. And I'll go back and look at your license agreement and see, but I'm pretty sure that that's actually an obligation. And upon request of the town, the company must provide this. It's very likely an obligation in the license agreement. So you have the right to, I know you've got the right to request it under your current license agreement. So you certainly can get that. I mean, I found that, I worked in a rural community up in upstate New York one time, and they had a number, not a lot, but they had certain lanes and roads where the company had just not gone down those because there was no subscribers for quite a long way. And that became a real point of contention during the renewal process. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Mr. Bruns.
Hi there. Thanks for calling on me. Thanks for the presentation this evening. I've been in town since 2011, and I think Kate's thing with the cables running across the ground is probably is even more exciting than what I've experienced with my friends at Comcast. Since 2011, we've been paying about $200 a month. Well, I think that's what we pay now. And I've called them many times because of poor service. Of all of the people they sent to my home, only 2 people were actually able to do things that actually made our lives a little better here with our cable. TV has been no trouble. Wi-Fi has been horrendous. I have a smart home. It would be delightful if it worked. You would love it here. But when things cut off and when Comcast robs Peter to pay Paul and somebody's drawing bandwidth, they have to take it from somewhere else, and there's a give and take going on. And well, I seem to be on the end that doesn't get all the Wi-Fi that I really need and pay for. They've come to the house many times. Finally, a crew ran a new wire from the pole to the house. That helped. And then another crew came and ran wire from where it attaches to the house into where we actually need it. But most of the time there were excuses, mostly about my equipment. Strangely, my equipment was purchased from the Comcast website. For example, I have a CM1000 modem, but they said that was just terrible and that I really needed their modem. I did end up finally with their modem, and things got not too much of a change until about the last 2 weeks, when things are working mysteriously better, perhaps because of today's meeting, but who knows? In short, poor service, expensive, hasn't really gotten better, except for the last 2 weeks, for which we are eternally grateful. My wife works from home here. And as I said, we have a smart home, and it's never quite worked the way we had in mind. I'm very interested. Oh, one last thing. So when there are outages in town, there are a bunch of us who are friends, and we call each other. Hey, you got Wi-Fi? No, we're out. And we go through this and we kind of figure out what part of town is down and who's still up. And it gets a little crazy. But I guess the bottom line is poor service, high expense. We have more expense coming. We have caps coming. I don't see it getting better. I don't see an escape. It seems that we're kind of stuck with Comcast. So I offer my services. I'm retired. I have plenty of time. And I would be delighted to take an active role in this with you. Call me if you like. That's all I got. Thanks, guys.
Great. That's great. We need people to get involved in this process, because part of what, and I appreciate that, part of what my job is to give you guys information. You know the locale, the community. I know a lot about cable and the law and what you can do with community media and all of those things. And if we get the right stew created here, okay, I think, and that's right. And information, me being an information provider is part of that stew. So I want to make sure that you have the information you need. If I can provide it, I will. And I think it's very important for people to be involved in this process, because it just makes the outcomes better.
Yes. Thank you.
I don't see other questions at the moment. Oh, there we go. Paul Gill.
Thank you. I'm not sure you'll recognize me as someone who has been a community TV producer since 1988.
You do look familiar. I don't know.
I was younger looking then.
So was I. My hair was dark.
But over the years, one thing has bothered me more than anything else. And it is that, since I go back to the original days of analog video equipment and analog delivery of TV signals over cable, I can remember when Channel 4 was so badly interfered with herringbone that we couldn't watch it at my house. But technology has really come a long way. And one of the areas, and of course, high definition TV started being delivered by Comcast, I think, 15 years ago? As a wild guess. Now, I was,
Yeah.
huh?
I said probably longer than that.
Okay, 20. But I was sitting in on a meeting at the old high school in the studio, and it was the annual meeting for CCTV.
Oh.
Or its predecessor, if it wasn't, I think it was called CCTV at the time. And what they reported was big expenditures at CCTV on high definition cameras and switching equipment and editing equipment. And I'm thinking, that's wonderful. So all we need now is for Comcast to provide 1 or 2 high definition channels for CCTV to deliver on. Maybe 1 would be enough, I think. But I was told, don't even bring that up. It's impossible. You'll never get it. The interface is too difficult. And I look at all the HD TV channels that are available to me now. Why can't one of those be Concord, Carlisle, or area community television? Because people are producing their shows in high def. So why not continue it all the way to the home? I don't think that problem has been solved. Am I right?
Well, actually, it has. Again, the issue really becomes, there are some communities in the country where all our access channels, that one I mentioned earlier, at Metro East, Portland suburbs, small community, all 8 channels are all HD. In many of the places, not all, but many places in Massachusetts that have gone through renewal in the last 3 years with Comcast. Comcast has, after the community showed that they wanted HD, Comcast has agreed to provide at least one of their channels in HD.
Wonderful.
So it's very possible, it's very practical, it's very reasonable to require 1 or more of your access channels to be in HD.
Can we do that?
Certainly, but you need to come out and participate in the stakeholder meetings and have all your buddies participate in the online survey, because you're going to be asked questions like that. Would you like to have your access channels in HD or whatever the most advanced? Who knows? It's going to be 5G in the future, you know?
Well,
So,
a lot of people think that YouTube is the substitute. But really what I want is I want to see the programs on my big screen in my playroom, not just on my computer.
well, and it's both. I mean, that's the key, is that, again, and this is why I'm going to circle right back to that thing where 87% of the people in your community subscribe to cable and can get the access channels because they're getting cable. That's really unusual. That's really good from the community's perspective and from Comcast's perspective. That in and of itself becomes a leverage point to make sure that those access channels are HD. Once the content is created in HD, here's the irony. You create it in HD, it goes out on YouTube in HD, but runs on the cable system in SD. Duh. Okay, it doesn't make any sense.
No.
Because what the company does is downgrade the signal once they get it to SD, even though it's delivered in HD. Why? Because they're not obligated to do it under the franchise agreement. There's no technical barrier to them doing it. There's no expensive barrier to them doing that, to being able to deliver in HD.
Thank you.
I still see no other questions on the hand raised anyway. And nobody whose picture I can see has their hand raised. Well, I guess we're probably can wrap it up.
Great.
Uh,
Well, it's good to get a chance to talk with everybody, and I really wish we could do this in person.
yes, well, thank you so much. It sure saves you a long plane trip.
But then I could visit my friend in Cambridge. So
There you go.
that's one of the advantages when we could do things and it wasn't COVID. I have one of my best girlfriends in the world lives in Cambridge, and we've known each other for 40 years. So when I come to work in Massachusetts, I stay at her house. I get to work and I get to see my friend at night. So that's great.
What?
And there's no hotel bill
Right.
for the city. So win-win.
Very good. Tim, any closing comments?
No, I think the meeting went rather well, and Sue and town council and I have some additional work to do, but I think the message is if you can identify people in the community that you think would be good additions to the team here, let us know about that. And we heard some people volunteering tonight their services, so we're going to need a lot of community participation, and Carlisle's known for that, so.
They are, and we have actually a very good community communication system. So we have a thing called City in the Woods that a huge number of people subscribe to. That's where I get a lot of my irate phone calls from. And we have the Tele Arnold system that works very, very well.
Okay. I guess that's an inside joke. No.
It's the old telegraph, telephone, and Tele Barney Arnold.
Oh, okay.
Well, okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being there. Happy New
Thank you
Year.
all. Thank you,
And
Sue.
look forward to making progress on this.
Bye-bye,
Okay.
guys.
Night.
Good night.